A couple of years ago, I was working as a delivery driver in the suburban areas around Dallas, Texas. It wasn't glamorous, but it was straightforward work, and I liked being on the road, listening to podcasts, and not having to deal with too many people face to face. Most of the deliveries were pretty routine. Drop the package off, take a photo if needed, head to the next one. But there's this one delivery I'll never forget. And to this day, it still unsettles me whenever I think about it. This all started in late February. I had a route that took me through various neighborhoods, some more out of the way than others. One day, I had a delivery scheduled for a house in a quiet, well-off suburban area. You know the kind of place. Manicured lawns, big houses with two-car garages, and those automatic sprinklers that seem to water everything but the lawn itself. When I pulled up to the house, it didn't stand out to me at first. It was like every other house in that neighborhood, nothing particularly creepy or run down. The instructions were simple. Just leave the package at the front door. I grabbed the box from the back of the van and walked up the driveway. As I reached the front door, I noticed something odd. The blinds in the windows were all drawn, which wasn't that unusual, but there was this weird feeling in the air. The house seemed too quiet. I shook it off because, after all, I'm not there to judge, just to drop off a package. I rang the doorbell like I usually do, out of habit more than anything, and started to turn away to go back to the van when I heard the door creak open behind me. I stopped and turned back around, expecting to see some older lady or a guy with his hands full of kids or something. Instead, there was this tall guy standing there wearing a large, realistic animal mask, something that looked like a wolf or a dog, maybe. It wasn't a cheap Halloween mask either. It was the kind of thing someone put a lot of time and money into, like it was professionally made. The guy didn't say anything. He just stood there, holding the door open with one hand, staring at me through the mask. He didn't reach for the package. He didn't wave or nod. Nothing, just staring. I don't know what came over me, but I suddenly felt really uncomfortable. I held the package out to him, and after what felt like forever, he slowly reached out and took it. Still, not a word. No nod, no thanks, no acknowledgement that I was even there. I mumbled something like, "Have a good day," and practically jogged back to my van. As soon as I got in, I locked the doors and sat there for a minute, trying to shake off the unease. I laughed at myself because it felt ridiculous to be freaked out by a guy in a mask. Maybe he was just into cosplay or some weird hobby. People are strange, right? It was weird, but I figured I'd never have to go back to that house again, so I let it go. But about a week later, I got another delivery scheduled for the same address. When I saw the location pop up on my route, I felt my stomach drop. Part of me wanted to ask my boss if someone else could take it, but that felt silly. It's just a house, I told myself, just some dude in a mask, no big deal. I drove over there and everything was the same as before. Quiet street, closed blinds, nothing out of place. I grabbed the package and headed up to the front door. My heart was already racing before I even got to the porch. I rang the doorbell again, hoping no one would answer so I could just leave the package and get out of there. The door opened almost immediately, like the guy had been waiting right on the other side. This time he was wearing a different mask. It was some kind of bird, a crow or a raven, I think. Like the last one, it was super realistic, way more detailed than any costume store mask I'd ever seen. Once again, he didn't speak. He just stood there, staring at me through the eye holes of the mask. I handed him the package without saying anything this time and turned to leave as fast as I could without outright running. As I was walking back to my van, I heard the door close softly behind me. I didn't look back, but I could feel that same weird, heavy feeling in the air, like I was being watched. I drove off as quickly as I could without breaking any traffic laws. I kept telling myself it was just some eccentric guy who liked masks. No harm, no foul, right? I didn't hear anything about the house or the guy for a while after that. And I didn't have any more deliveries scheduled for that address, so it started to fade from my mind. But then, a few weeks later, it came up again, in the worst way possible. I was scrolling through the local news online one evening when I saw an article about a string of kidnappings that had taken place in the surrounding areas. The police had arrested someone in connection with the crimes, a man living in the very same neighborhood where I'd been making those deliveries. My heart skipped a beat when I saw the address in the article. It was the same house. The guy they arrested was apparently responsible for abducting several people over the span of a few months, and he'd been keeping them in his basement. The article didn't go into too much detail, but they said he used various disguises to lure people into a false sense of security. There was no mention of the masks specifically, but I knew it had to be him. There couldn't be that many people in one neighborhood with a collection of creepy animal masks. I didn't say anything to my boss or anyone else at work about it. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to be involved, or maybe I just didn't want to think about how close I might have come to being one of those victims. I've delivered to hundreds of houses since then, but every now and then, when I see a house with the blinds drawn or someone acting a little off, I get that same uneasy feeling in my gut, and I can't help but wonder, what if I had gone back a third time? It's something that still sticks with me, even though I've moved on from that job. I'm not easily scared, and I've never had any kind of traumatic experience before, but those deliveries messed with me. I don't know if it was just the masks or the guy's creepy silence, or if it was knowing after the fact what he was capable of. Whatever it was, it left a mark, and I still think about it sometimes when I'm out driving at night or dropping off packages in isolated areas. I don't work delivery anymore. I got a new job a little over a year ago, something that keeps me mostly indoors. It's probably for the best. Every time I pull up to someone's house now, even if it's just visiting a friend or dropping something off for a family member, I get that knot in my stomach. I find myself looking over my shoulder more often, double-checking if I lock the doors. Maybe it's just paranoia, but I figure it's better to be safe than sorry. I never saw the guy in the mask again after that second delivery. Part of me wonders if he even remembers me, or if I was just another faceless delivery guy to him. Maybe I wasn't important enough to be noticed. Or maybe I just got lucky. Whatever the case, I'm glad I didn't go back. I don't think I could have handled a third encounter, knowing what I know now. I used to work as a delivery driver a couple of years ago, mostly for Amazon. I've moved on to a different job since then, but back in 2019, I was working crazy hours trying to save up enough money to get out of a crappy apartment in North Houston. I was doing deliveries in the outer suburbs of Houston, mostly around the Spring area. For those of you who don't know, Spring is this sprawling suburban neighborhood about 25 minutes north of downtown Houston. A lot of the streets are these cookie-cutter suburban developments. But if you drive a little further out, you start getting into more isolated areas. Long stretches of road with no streetlights, no sidewalks, just these large, quiet houses spaced out by big patches of land. That's where this happened. It was late November. I was on the last stretch of my shift, so it was already dark outside. Most people would have wrapped up their deliveries earlier, but I'd gotten stuck with a heavy load that day, so I was running behind. I wasn't too far from finishing up, maybe 4 or 5 stops left, and I was itching to get home. The roads in that area were super quiet. The houses were far apart and the streets weren't lit, so my headlights were the only source of light for miles. One of my stops was in this really quiet neighborhood just off of Cypresswood Drive. I didn't think much of it when I pulled up to the address. Another generic suburban house, but this one was pretty far back from the street. There weren't any cars in the driveway and the porch light wasn't on, but that wasn't unusual. Sometimes people don't bother to leave lights on for the delivery guys. Still, it made the place seem darker and emptier than the others. I parked by the curb, grabbed the package from the back, and walked up to the front door. The neighborhood was silent, like completely dead. The kind of silence where you feel like you're the only person around for miles. No wind, no distant sounds of traffic, just nothing. I don't know why, but I suddenly felt a little uneasy as I walked up to the door. I brushed it off, telling myself that I was just tired and ready to go home. I got to the front porch, set the package down, and snapped the obligatory photo to prove the delivery was made. As I turned to head back to my van, I heard this faint tapping sound. It was quiet, just on the edge of my hearing, but it was definitely coming from inside the house. I stopped and listened, figuring maybe someone was inside. Sometimes you get people who want to make sure their package is delivered in person, so they'll knock or tap on the window to get your attention. I thought maybe that was what was happening here, but the tapping didn't sound like someone trying to get my attention. It was slow, almost rhythmic, and there was something off about it. It was too light to be knocking, more like fingers tapping on glass. I stood there for a second, staring at the dark windows, trying to figure out where it was coming from. I didn't see anything at first, so I shrugged it off and headed back to my van. I had just about reached the sidewalk when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. I glanced back at the house and noticed a figure standing in one of the front windows behind the drawn curtains. I couldn't make out any details because the curtains were partially closed, but there was definitely someone standing there completely still, just watching me. My heart skipped a beat, but I told myself it was nothing. Probably just the homeowner checking to see if I'd actually delivered the package. It wasn't the first time I'd seen people watching me from their windows, but there was something unsettling about the way this person was standing so still. Most people, when they peek through their windows, will move around or shift a bit when they realize they've been spotted. But this person didn't move at all, just stood there, barely visible in the shadows behind the curtain. I quickly got into my van, feeling more uncomfortable than I wanted to admit. As I started the engine, I glanced back at the house again. The figure was still there, still watching. My headlights reflected off the glass for a second, and I thought I saw them tilt their head slightly, but it was so quick I couldn't be sure. I put the van in gear and drove off, telling myself I was overthinking things. The rest of my deliveries went by without a hitch, but I couldn't stop thinking about that house. I kept telling myself it was nothing, but the image of that figure standing so still in the window stayed with me. It wasn't like it was a full-blown creepy moment, but there was something off. I finished my shift, got home, and tried to forget about it. A couple of days later, I was back on the same route. I had almost forgotten about the weird figure in the window, but then as I was scrolling through my deliveries for the day, I noticed that the same house was on my list again. It wasn't super uncommon to deliver to the same places multiple times. People order stuff all the time. But I felt that same unease creep back up when I saw the address. I didn't want to overthink it, so I shrugged it off and went about my day. But as the day wore on, and I got closer to that house, I couldn't help but feel a little on edge. It was getting late again, close to the end of my shift, when I finally reached the street. This time, there was a car in the driveway, a dark sedan. The porch light was still off, but seeing the car made me feel a bit more at ease. At least someone was home this time, which somehow made the house feel less eerie. I grabbed the package and walked up to the front door again. The neighborhood was just as quiet as before, and even though there were other houses nearby, it felt like I was completely alone out there. I set the package down, took the delivery photo, and then stood there for a second, almost expecting to hear that same tapping again. But everything was silent this time. No noise from inside, no figures standing in the windows. I felt a weird sense of relief wash over me. Like maybe I'd just been imagining things the last time I was there. I started to head back to the van, but just before I reached it, I glanced back at the house one more time. That's when I saw it. The figure was back in the window. Same spot, same eerie stillness, just standing there behind the curtain. My heart raced, and I felt this cold chill run down my spine. I didn't stop to stare this time. I jumped into the van and drove off, trying to get as far away from that house as quickly as possible. I don't know why it freaked me out so much, but the fact that this person just stood there, not moving, not doing anything, just watching, it felt wrong. I finished up my deliveries that night and went home, but I couldn't shake that feeling of unease. I didn't say anything to anyone about it because, honestly, what was there to say? Some person was standing in their own window. It wasn't like anything illegal or dangerous was happening. But the more I thought about it, the more unsettled I felt. It was the stillness, the complete lack of movement or reaction from whoever was behind that curtain. I couldn't explain it, but it just felt off. I didn't have any more deliveries to that house after that night, but I still think about it sometimes. Whenever I drive through quiet suburban areas, especially at night, I can't help but glance at the windows of the houses I pass by. I don't know what I'm expecting to see, but part of me is always bracing for that same eerie stillness, that same unsettling figure standing just out of sight. Looking back, I still don't know what to make of it. Maybe it was just a homeowner with weird habits, or maybe they were messing with me for some reason. But there was something about the way that figure stood there, completely still, never moving, never reacting, that still gets under my skin to this day. I've driven past plenty of creepy places in my time as a delivery driver, but nothing has ever left me feeling as unsettled as that house did. And even now, every once in a while, when I'm driving home late at night and pass by a quiet, darkened house, I find myself glancing at the windows, half expecting to see someone or something standing there in the shadows just watching. Back in 2018, I was working for one of those independent courier companies that contract out deliveries for different online retailers. It was decent work, and the money wasn't terrible, but the hours were pretty brutal. If you've ever worked delivery, you know what I mean. Long days, sometimes into the night, driving around unfamiliar neighborhoods, and lugging packages up to people's doors. I didn't mind it too much at first, but after a while the job started to wear on me, especially after this one delivery. I was living in Atlanta at the time, running deliveries all over the metro area. You'd think that working in a big city like that, everything would be busy, crowded, and well lit. But there are plenty of areas just outside of the city that feel like you're in the middle of nowhere. One day I got assigned a route that took me out to one of those areas, a suburban neighborhood that had seen better days. You could tell it was one of those places that had been nice maybe 20 or 30 years ago, but now it was kind of run down. The houses were still standing, but a lot of them were empty, with for sale signs in the yards that looked like they'd been there forever. It was late afternoon when I pulled up to this house on my list. The address was on one of the side streets, a little cul-de-sac that was tucked away at the back of the neighborhood. There wasn't much around, just a few scattered houses, most of them looking like they hadn't been lived in for a while. The place I was supposed to deliver to was listed as unoccupied due to renovations. That wasn't too unusual. I'd delivered to houses that were being renovated before. Usually it meant leaving the package at the door for the contractor to pick up later. When I pulled up, though, something about the house seemed off right away. It was a 2-story place with faded beige siding and a bunch of overgrown bushes out front. There wasn't any sign of construction work. No trucks, no tools, no dumpsters full of debris. It looked like nobody had touched the place in a long time. The windows were all dark and the front yard was a mess. Weeds growing up through the cracks in the sidewalk. I parked the van and got out with the package. As I walked up to the front door, I noticed that the mailbox was overflowing with old letters and flyers. Again, not that unusual for an unoccupied house, but it just added to the weird feeling I was getting. I figured I'd just drop the package off and get out of there quickly, but as I got closer, I heard something that made me stop in my tracks. It was this soft, scraping noise coming from inside the house. At first, I thought maybe there were workers inside doing some late-day renovations. But when I looked around again, there was no sign of any activity, no lights, no vehicles. The noise was faint, almost like someone was dragging something heavy across the floor. I stood there for a second, trying to figure out what it could be, and then decided to peek in through one of the windows near the front door. I know. It sounds stupid, but my curiosity got the better of me. I crouched down and tried to peer through the dirty glass. The inside of the house looked as abandoned as the outside. Bare walls, dusty floors, nothing that indicated anyone had been there recently. But then, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. There was a table in what looked like the dining room. It wasn't covered with a sheet or anything like you'd expect in a vacant house. Instead, there were plates and silverware set out, like someone had just been sitting down to eat. Even stranger, there were half-eaten meals on the plates, like food that had been left there for hours, maybe even days. The glasses were still half full of water or some kind of drink. It was like whoever had been living there had just gotten up in the middle of dinner and left without finishing. I backed away from the window, trying to wrap my head around what I'd just seen. The house had supposedly been vacant for a while, at least according to the delivery instructions. So why was there fresh food on the table? I started to feel really uneasy, and that's when I heard the scraping sound again, only this time it was louder, like it was coming from right inside the front door. I froze for a second, my hand still holding the package. My heart was pounding in my chest, and all I could think was that maybe someone was squatting in the house. I didn't want to deal with that. I wasn't paid enough to confront squatters, so I quickly dropped the package on the doorstep and started heading back to my van. As I was walking back down the driveway, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. That's when I noticed something in one of the upstairs windows. There was a shadow, a figure standing just behind the glass. I couldn't make out any details, but it was definitely a person. They weren't moving, just standing there watching me. My stomach dropped and I picked up my pace, practically jogging to my van. I got in, locked the doors, and sat there for a second, trying to calm myself down. I kept telling myself that it was probably just a worker or someone checking in on the place, but that didn't explain the half-eaten meals or the fact that the house was supposed to be vacant. And whoever was upstairs, they hadn't made any effort to come to the door or acknowledge me. They were just standing there. I didn't stick around to figure out what was going on. I started the van and pulled out of there as fast as I could without speeding. The rest of my deliveries that day were a blur. I kept thinking about that house, about the figure in the window, the food on the table, the scraping sound. Something wasn't right about that place, but I didn't have any way to explain it. A couple of days later, I was back on a different route, trying to push that whole experience out of my mind. But then, I overheard one of my coworkers talking about a house that had been abandoned for years after the family that lived there disappeared. My ears perked up when I heard the address. It was the same house I had delivered to. The coworker said that the family had gone missing under mysterious circumstances about a year ago, and nobody had been able to figure out what happened to them. The house had been vacant ever since, except for the occasional contractor who came by to check on it. That was the first time I really felt the full weight of what I'd seen. If the house had been abandoned for that long, then who was inside when I made that delivery? And what was up with the half-eaten meals? I didn't say anything to my coworker about what I'd seen. I didn't want to sound crazy. And honestly, I wasn't even sure if I believed it myself. Eventually, I moved on from the delivery job and started working somewhere else. I didn't have any more reason to go back to that neighborhood, and I didn't think much about the house after that. But every now and then, when I'm driving through certain parts of town or passing by a house that looks a little too empty, I get this uneasy feeling, like maybe I'm going to see another shadow in the window or hear that same scraping sound coming from inside. Back in 2017, I was working as a delivery driver for a big online retailer. I lived in Portland, Oregon, and the delivery routes often took me to the outskirts of the city, to those isolated residential neighborhoods that seemed to stretch on forever with nothing but trees and hills between houses. You'd drive miles out of the city, and the houses would get bigger, but they'd also get more spread out, sitting on these huge plots of land with driveways that felt like they went on forever. You could go from one house to the next without seeing a single person. One day, I was on a route that took me to one of those more isolated areas just outside of Beaverton. It was late afternoon, and I was already a bit behind schedule. The sun was starting to go down, and I still had a handful of deliveries left. One of them was for a house tucked way up on this hill off a long, winding road that cut through the forest. When I got the delivery details, I noticed that the instructions said to leave the package inside the garage, which wasn't that unusual. Some people don't like having packages left out in the open, especially in more rural areas where they could get stolen or damaged. I drove up the long, steep driveway, and when I finally reached the house, I felt a little uneasy, though I couldn't really say why. The house itself was pretty big, a 2-story place with dark wooden siding and a bunch of tall trees surrounding it. It looked like no one had lived there for a while. The lawn was overgrown, and there were patches of weeds creeping up the driveway. There weren't any lights on inside, which wasn't a big deal, but the whole place had this weird, deserted feeling to it. Still, it wasn't the worst place I'd been to, so I grabbed the package and made my way toward the garage. The door was already open, which struck me as a little strange. I hadn't seen any cars in the driveway, and usually, if someone was home, they'd close the garage after coming in. But I figured maybe the homeowner had left it open for me, like the instructions said. I stepped inside the garage, and it was dark, the only light coming from the dim, fading sunlight outside. I walked in a little further, trying to find a good spot to leave the package, when suddenly I heard the garage door slam shut behind me. My stomach dropped. I hadn't even touched the door, so I had no idea how it had closed on its own. The noise echoed through the empty garage, and for a moment, I just stood there frozen, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I turned around and tried to open the garage door from the inside, but there wasn't any visible button or switch that I could find. I started feeling around the walls, but the only thing I could feel was cold concrete and dusty shelving. I tried the door again, thinking maybe it had jammed, but it wouldn't budge. I was starting to panic, but I didn't want to completely lose it just yet. I pulled out my phone to call for help, but of course I had no signal. This was the one thing I hated about doing these deliveries in the middle of nowhere: bad reception. I waved my phone around, trying to catch a bar of service, but it was useless. My heart was racing now, and I felt this creeping anxiety settle over me. Then I heard something faint, almost like footsteps, coming from above me. I paused and listened, and sure enough, there was this soft creaking, like someone was walking around on the floor above the garage. It wasn't super loud, but it was definitely there, and it sent a chill down my spine. I hadn't seen any cars or signs that anyone was home, so who the hell was upstairs? I waited for a second, hoping that maybe it was just my imagination, but the footsteps didn't stop. They kept moving, slow and deliberate, like someone was pacing back and forth. I couldn't tell exactly where they were coming from, but they were definitely above me, maybe in a room that was connected to the garage. I couldn't see a door or anything from where I was standing, so I had no way of knowing what was up there, but the longer I stood there, the more freaked out I got. I started banging on the garage door, hoping that whoever was inside would hear me and open it, but nothing happened. The footsteps just kept going back and forth, never speeding up, never slowing down. I felt trapped, like I had no way out, and every second that passed made me feel more and more on edge. I don't know how long I stood there, banging on the door and trying to figure out what to do. It could have been minutes or maybe longer, but it felt like forever. At some point, I stopped and just listened, trying to figure out if the footsteps were getting closer. They weren't. They just kept pacing in that same steady rhythm. I couldn't tell if whoever was upstairs even knew I was down there, or if they were just waiting. I didn't want to stick around and find out. I started looking for another way out of the garage, but there were no other doors, just the one that led into the house, which was locked. I thought about trying to break it down, but it looked solid, and I didn't want to risk making more noise than I already had. There were some windows high up on the garage walls, but they were too small for me to fit through, and even if I could have reached them, they were covered with some kind of metal grate. By this point, I was feeling pretty desperate. My phone still didn't have any signal, and the sun was almost completely down, leaving the garage in this eerie twilight. I could still hear the footsteps above me, but they hadn't changed at all. It was like whoever was up there was stuck on a loop, pacing back and forth, back and forth. I tried to stay calm and think logically. Maybe the door had some kind of automatic mechanism that I just couldn't find, and maybe the footsteps were just a coincidence. But that didn't make me feel any better. I was stuck in a dark garage in the middle of nowhere, with no way to call for help, and someone, or something, was moving around above me. I don't know what made me do it, but after what felt like hours of trying to get the door open and searching for another way out, I decided to just wait. Maybe whoever was upstairs would leave, or maybe the garage door would open on its own again, like it had closed. I sat down on the cold concrete floor, trying to keep myself calm, but it was hard with the footsteps still going on above me. I don't know how long I sat there. Maybe it was only 30 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. The footsteps never stopped, but eventually they started to fade, like whoever was pacing had moved further away from the garage. I waited for a few more minutes trying to make sure they were really gone, and then I slowly stood up and tried the door again. This time, when I pressed my hand against it, I felt it give a little. I pushed harder, and to my relief it started to roll up. Slowly at first, then faster as the mechanism kicked in. I don't know what had changed, but I wasn't about to question it. As soon as the door was open enough for me to slip out, I bolted. I didn't stop to look back or try to figure out who or what had been upstairs. I just ran to my van, jumped in, and got the hell out of there. I drove straight home after that. I didn't even finish the rest of my deliveries. When I got back to the warehouse, I told my boss that I wasn't feeling well and that I needed to take the rest of the day off. I didn't mention what had happened. I didn't want to sound crazy. But I think he could tell something was off because he didn't ask too many questions. I never went back to that house again. And I never asked my coworkers if they'd delivered there either. Some things are better left alone, I guess, but every now and then when I'm out driving and I pass a house that looks a little too quiet, a little too empty, I think about that garage and those footsteps. And I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't gotten out of there when I did. This happened back in the spring of 2018. It was a cold, rainy day in late March. I remember it vividly because it was one of those days where the rain wasn't just a drizzle but a relentless downpour. Everything was gray. Gray sky, gray roads, gray houses. It felt like the entire world was soaked and heavy. The roads were slick with water, and there were puddles everywhere. By the time I was halfway through my deliveries, my clothes were damp even though I was wearing a raincoat. My boots were soaked, and I was getting that cold, uncomfortable feeling in my bones that you only get when you've been wet for too long. That day, my route took me out into the more remote areas around Williamsport. If you've ever been to rural Pennsylvania, you know what I'm talking about. Long stretches of road with nothing but woods on either side, punctuated by the occasional farm or isolated house. I wasn't too far from finishing up my deliveries when I got this stop for an old farmhouse on the outskirts of town. It wasn't in the middle of nowhere exactly, but it was far enough away from anything that it felt pretty isolated. When I got to the house, I could barely see it through the rain. It was one of those old, white-painted farmhouses with a sagging porch and peeling paint. The yard was overgrown, and the driveway was just a dirt path that had turned into a muddy mess. There were no cars in sight, no lights on inside, nothing to indicate that anyone had been around recently. I pulled up to the house, and for a second I considered just leaving the package on the porch and heading back to my van. But the rain was coming down so hard that I figured the package would get soaked before the homeowner even had a chance to grab it, so I decided to knock on the door. I ran up to the porch, huddling under the overhang to get out of the rain for a minute. The place looked pretty run down up close, like it hadn't been maintained in years. There were cracks in the porch steps, and the windows were covered in grime. Still, I knocked on the door, hoping that someone would be home so I could hand the package off directly. After a few moments, the door creaked open and this old man stepped out. He must have been in his 70s or 80s, thin and hunched over with a head of wild gray hair and a long beard. He had this weathered look about him, like he'd spent his entire life working outside. His clothes were old and worn, like he hadn't bothered to replace them in years. He smiled at me, though, and thanked me for coming out in the rain. I was cold and soaked to the bone, so when he offered to let me come inside to warm up for a bit, I didn't immediately say no. Normally, I'd just brush off offers like that and get back to my van, but the rain was coming down harder than ever, and I figured there was no harm in sitting down for a few minutes to get out of the storm. Besides, the guy seemed harmless enough. Just an old man living alone in the middle of nowhere. I stepped inside, and the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. The house was dark, with just a dim light coming from the kitchen. There wasn't much in the way of furniture, just an old sofa, a couple of chairs. and a table in the corner. The place had this musty smell to it, like it hadn't been aired out in a long time. The wallpaper was peeling in some spots, and there were stains on the ceiling from years of leaks. It wasn't dirty exactly, but it had this feeling of neglect, like no one had really taken care of it for a long time. The old man motioned for me to sit down at the kitchen table while he put on a pot of coffee. I sat down, rubbing my hands together to warm them up. The rain was still pounding against the windows, and I was grateful to be inside, even if the house felt a little off. The old man didn't say much at first, just made small talk about the weather and how he didn't get many visitors out this way. I tried to be polite, but something about the whole situation was starting to make me uncomfortable. As he puttered around the kitchen, I couldn't help but notice how strange his behavior was. He kept asking me these odd personal questions, stuff that didn't really make sense for someone who'd just met me. He wanted to know if I lived nearby, if I had family in the area, if anyone knew where I was that day. It wasn't like he was being aggressive or anything, but the questions felt out of place, especially since we were practically strangers. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe he was just lonely or not all there mentally, but the more he talked, the more uneasy I started to feel. He kept repeating certain phrases like he was stuck in a loop, and he'd pause in the middle of sentences to stare at me with this strange look in his eyes. It was like he was trying to size me up or figure something out about me, but I couldn't tell what. It got to the point where I was just waiting for an excuse to leave. The coffee finally finished brewing, and he poured me a cup, but by then I was too on edge to stay any longer. I made up some excuse about needing to get back to work, even though I still had some time before my shift ended. He didn't seem too bothered by it, just nodded and walked me to the door. I thanked him for the coffee, stepped back out into the rain, and headed straight for my van without looking back. As soon as I was in the van, I locked the doors and sat there for a minute, trying to shake off the weird feeling that had settled over me. I couldn't explain why, but the whole interaction had left me feeling uneasy, like there was something not quite right about that old man or that house. It wasn't anything obvious, just a weird vibe that I couldn't shake. I finished up my route that day and went home, trying to put the experience behind me. But a few days later, I saw something on the local news that made my blood run cold. They were talking about an old man who had been found dead in a farmhouse not too far from where I had made that delivery. According to the report, he'd been dead for a while, probably weeks, if not longer. The police didn't suspect foul play, but the neighbors had called it in after noticing that the house had been quiet for a long time. The farmhouse they were talking about was the same one I had delivered to. I recognized it from the footage they showed on the news, the same peeling paint, the same sagging porch. But what really got to me was the timeline. If the old man had been dead for weeks, then who the hell had I been talking to? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a different house, or maybe I had just misremembered the location. But deep down, I knew it was the same place. I couldn't explain it, and I didn't want to think about it too much, but the whole thing left me feeling unsettled in a way I couldn't shake. I didn't tell anyone about it because I figured no one would believe me, and honestly, I wasn't even sure if I believed it myself. This happened a few years ago when I was working as a delivery driver for a local courier company. The job wasn't anything special, just delivering packages around town, and most days it was pretty straightforward. But this one night stood out, and not in a good way. It was sometime in the fall, around mid-October, I think. The weather in Seattle was doing its usual thing, cool, gray, and drizzling off and on. I'd been out on my route for most of the day, and by the time I got to this particular delivery, it was already getting dark. I was tired and just trying to finish my shift so I could head home. The area I was delivering to was one of those older neighborhoods that had seen better days, mostly a mix of older houses and a few that looked like they'd been abandoned or were in the process of being renovated. It wasn't the nicest part of town, but it wasn't the worst either. The delivery was for this big, old house on a side street that I'd never been to before. It wasn't run down exactly, but it definitely had a kind of neglected look to it. The paint was peeling off the siding, the windows were covered with dust, and the yard was overgrown with weeds. The house sat back from the road a bit, with a narrow gravel driveway leading down the side to a basement entrance. The instructions on the delivery said to leave the package by the basement door, which wasn't something I'd seen before but didn't think too much of it at the time. I pulled up to the house, parked my van, and grabbed the package from the back. The whole area was quiet, with hardly any cars driving by, and the house was completely dark. No porch lights, no sign of anyone inside. I figured whoever lived there just wasn't home or didn't want to answer the door, which happens more often than you'd think when you're in this line of work. I walked down the driveway toward the basement door, which was around the back of the house, tucked away down a narrow alley between the house and a tall wooden fence that bordered the neighbor's yard. The alley was barely wide enough for me to squeeze through with the package. As I made my way down, I noticed how quiet everything was. The only sound was the crunch of gravel under my boots and the distant hum of traffic from the main road a few blocks away. When I got to the basement door, it was this old, heavy wooden thing with peeling paint. There was no light above it, and the whole area was in shadow, which made it feel even more claustrophobic. I set the package down in front of the door and was about to snap a picture for proof of delivery when I heard something inside the house. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct. A kind of low, dragging sound like something heavy being pulled across the floor. I froze for a second, listening, trying to figure out what it was. Maybe someone was moving furniture around upstairs, I thought. But the sound didn't seem to be coming from above me. It felt closer, like it was right on the other side of the basement door. I stood there for a moment, trying to decide whether I should knock or just leave. The sound continued, slow and steady, like whatever was being dragged was scraping against the floor. My mind immediately started going to the worst-case scenario. What if someone was hurt inside? What if they were trying to move but couldn't get up? I debated with myself for a minute, but ultimately, I figured it wasn't my business, and I didn't want to get involved. I'd had plenty of weird encounters on this job before, and they rarely ended well for me when I tried to intervene. I snapped the picture of the package and turned to leave, but as I did, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. Just beneath one of the small, dirty basement windows near the ground, there was something that looked like freshly disturbed dirt. It wasn't a lot, but it was noticeable. A small mound of earth pushed up against the wall of the house. And sticking out from under the dirt, barely visible in the fading light, was what looked like the corner of a blanket or some kind of fabric. My heart started pounding in my chest, and I felt this overwhelming sense of unease. I didn't know what to make of it, and for a second, I thought about going back to my van and calling the police. But then I convinced myself that it was probably nothing. Maybe it was just an old blanket someone had thrown out, or maybe the house was being renovated and the workers had left it there. I didn't want to think about the alternative. I've seen enough true crime documentaries to know that my mind was probably playing tricks on me, jumping to the worst conclusions. I told myself to just walk away, get back in the van, and finish the rest of my deliveries. But as I started back down the alley, I couldn't stop thinking about the dragging sound, the fresh dirt, and that damn piece of fabric sticking out of the ground. What if there really was something going on inside that house? What if someone was in trouble and needed help? I stopped halfway down the alley and turned back, staring at the basement door again, trying to convince myself that it wasn't my problem, that I should just leave. Then I heard it again. The dragging noise, only this time it was louder, more insistent, like something heavy was being pulled closer to the door. I felt a knot form in my stomach. I knew I should have left right then and there, but my curiosity got the better of me. I slowly walked back toward the door, careful not to make too much noise, and leaned in closer to the window above the dirt patch. The window was small and dirty, but I could just make out the faint outline of the basement inside. It was dark, with only a sliver of light coming from what looked like a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. I squinted, trying to see more clearly, and that's when I saw movement. Something shifted in the shadows, something large and bulky, like a person crouching or kneeling on the floor. I couldn't see any details, just the vague shape of someone or something moving around in the darkness. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to leave, to just run back to the van and forget the whole thing. But another part of me felt like I had to know what was going on in that basement. I started to back away slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, when suddenly the door creaked open, just a crack. I froze. The door hadn't been locked after all. It was just stuck. I stood there staring at the gap in the door, waiting for something, anything, to happen. For a moment, nothing did. Then the dragging noise stopped. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my own breathing, ragged and shallow. I didn't stick around to see what would happen next. I turned and bolted back down the alley, my boots slipping on the wet gravel as I sprinted toward the van. I threw the door open, jumped inside, and slammed it shut, locking it behind me. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys, but I finally managed to get the engine started and pulled away from the house as fast as I could without skidding off the road. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone chasing after me or standing in the driveway, watching me leave. But there was nothing. Just the dark, rain-soaked street fading into the distance behind me. I didn't go back to that neighborhood again after that night. I didn't report what I saw to anyone, partly because I wasn't sure what I'd even seen, and partly because I didn't want to deal with the fallout if it turned out to be nothing. I finished my shift in a daze, going through the motions without really paying attention to what I was doing. I kept telling myself that it was just some weird coincidence, that there was a perfectly logical explanation for the dirt, the dragging sound, and the figure in the basement. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right about that house. I don't know what was going on in that basement, and I'm not sure I want to know. All I know is that I was glad to get out of there when I did, and I haven't been back to that part of town since. I don't think I'll ever know what was really happening in that basement, and honestly, I'm okay with that. Some things are better left alone, and whatever was going on in that house, it wasn't something I wanted to get involved with. It was mid-fall, late afternoon, when this happened. The days were getting shorter, and by the time I'd hit the last few stops on my route, it was usually dusk. This day was no different. Long hours and a growing sense of wanting to just finish and go home. I had one last stop, which was way out of the way in a rural area north of Boulder. The address popped up on my GPS, and as soon as I saw it, I knew it was going to be a pain to get to. The house was at the end of this long dirt road, surrounded by nothing but open land and some patches of trees. No neighbors nearby, no street lights, just a lot of empty space. I drove out there, and as I got closer to the house, the road started getting rougher. It was full of potholes and dips, and I had to slow down a lot to keep from messing up my van. The house itself was pretty isolated, one of those older ranch-style places that looked like it had been there for a while but hadn't been well maintained. The paint was peeling off the siding, and the grass in the front yard was overgrown. There were no cars in the driveway, no lights on inside, nothing to suggest that anyone was home. But I figured that wasn't too unusual. Lots of people out in these rural areas work late or travel, and they still get packages delivered whether they're home or not. I parked the van and grabbed the package, a medium-sized box that felt a little heavier than I expected. As I walked up to the front door, I noticed that the windows were all closed, and the blinds were drawn. Everything was shut up tight, which wasn't strange for a house in the middle of nowhere, but it added to the overall feeling of isolation. I rang the doorbell, more out of habit than anything else, and waited a few seconds. No one answered, so I set the package down by the door and turned to leave. Just as I was about to step off the porch, I heard the door creak open behind me. I stopped and turned around, expecting to see someone coming out to grab the package. Instead, the door had only opened a few inches, and from the darkness inside, a figure stepped into view. It was a guy wearing a black hoodie with the hood pulled up over his head, covering most of his face. He didn't say anything, just stood there in the doorway, staring at me. I couldn't see his eyes clearly, but I could tell he was watching me. The whole situation immediately felt off. There was something about the way he just stood there in silence that made me feel uneasy. I'd had plenty of weird encounters with people while delivering packages, but this was different. I couldn't see any expression on his face, and he didn't make any attempt to come closer or grab the package. He just stood there, barely visible in the dim light coming from inside the house. I hesitated for a second, thinking maybe I should say something, but then decided against it. I figured it was best to just leave and get out of there as quickly as possible. I turned back around, walked down the porch steps, and started heading toward the van. As I was walking, I could feel the guy's eyes on me the entire time. He didn't close the door, didn't move, just kept standing there, watching me as I got into the van. I drove off as fast as I could without making it too obvious that I was in a hurry. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw that the guy was still standing in the doorway, watching me leave. It gave me a weird feeling, but I brushed it off and told myself that it was just some guy being creepy. I figured I'd never have to go back there again, so it wasn't worth worrying about. A few days later, I got another delivery for the same address. As soon as I saw it pop up on my route, I felt this tightness in my chest. I didn't want to go back to that house, but I didn't have a choice. It was part of my assigned deliveries, and there was no way around it. I tried to psych myself up as I drove out there again. It was just a house, just a guy in a hoodie, probably nothing to worry about. Maybe he was just socially awkward or had some other reason for acting weird. I kept telling myself that, but the closer I got to the house, the more anxious I started to feel. When I pulled up, everything looked the same as it had the first time. Dark house, no cars in the driveway, nothing that suggested anyone was home. I sat in the van for a minute, trying to decide whether I should just leave the package at the door and go, or if I should knock again to see if anyone was there. I ended up deciding to just leave the package and get out of there as quickly as possible. I walked up to the porch and set the package down in the same spot as before. As I turned to leave, I heard the sound of the door creaking open again, just like it had last time. My heart started racing and I forced myself to look back. The same guy was standing there in the doorway wearing the same black hoodie. He hadn't moved since the last time I'd been there. He didn't say anything, didn't step forward, just stood there, silently staring at me from the shadows. I couldn't see his face at all this time, just the outline of his body and the dim light from inside the house. I didn't stick around. I turned and practically ran back to the van, jumped in, and drove off. My hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel, and my mind was racing with all kinds of thoughts about who this guy was and what he wanted. There was something seriously wrong with that whole situation, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. I didn't mention anything to my boss or my co-workers about the guy. I didn't want to sound paranoid or like I was making a big deal out of nothing. But the experience stuck with me, and every time I got a delivery in that area, I'd tense up, half expecting to see that address pop up on my route again. A few weeks passed without incident, and I started to relax a little, thinking maybe I'd just been overreacting. But then one day, I got a call from my supervisor. He sounded confused and a little concerned. He asked me why I'd marked a package as delivered to the address when the customer had been dead for months. I didn't know what to say. I told him that I'd delivered packages there a few times recently, and each time someone had been there to take them. My supervisor told me that wasn't possible. The house had been empty since the previous owner passed away, and no one had lived there since. He said they were investigating why deliveries had been made to that address when no one was supposed to be there. I didn't know what to think. The guy I'd seen had been real. He had opened the door and stood there watching me twice. But according to my supervisor, there shouldn't have been anyone there at all. Maybe it was just some guy squatting in the house, or maybe there was something more to it than that. Either way, I'm glad I don't have to go back there. I try not to think about it too much, but it still lingers in the back of my mind. A strange and unsettling memory that never quite goes away. This happened back in 2021 when I was working as a delivery driver. It was late fall, sometime in November, I think. The sun was setting earlier, and by the time I got to the last few stops on my route, it was usually dark out. The weather was getting colder too. Not quite freezing, but that kind of damp cold that seeps into your bones and makes you feel miserable. I remember that day specifically because it had been a long one and I was running behind on my deliveries. I'd been stuck in traffic for over an hour on the highway, so I didn't get to my last stop until after dark. The address was for a gated estate out in the more rural part of Massachusetts, a little past Concord. These kinds of places weren't unusual on my route. Big houses set back from the road with long driveways and private gates. The kind of places where you know the people have money, but you never actually see them. I'd been to a few estates before, but this one was different. It was farther out, more isolated. The directions said to leave the package at the front door, which wasn't anything out of the ordinary, so I didn't think much of it at first. When I pulled up to the property, the iron gate was already open, which struck me as odd. Usually, these places had security systems that would make you call in or buzz for entry. But this gate was wide open, like they were expecting me. The driveway was long and lined with tall trees, their bare branches twisting overhead, casting shadows in the dim light from my van's headlights. There were no lights on in the house, no street lights, nothing but the darkness and the crunch of gravel under my tires. I drove up the long driveway feeling more and more uneasy as I got closer to the house. The place was huge. One of those old colonial-style mansions that looked like it had been there for 100 years or more. The windows were dark, and there was this sense of stillness about the place that made me feel like no one had lived there in a long time. But the gate had been open, and someone had ordered a package, so I figured maybe the owners were just away or something. I parked the van near the front steps, grabbed the package, and started walking up to the door. That's when I noticed the security cameras. There were several of them, mounted on the corners of the house and on poles along the driveway. They were all pointed directly at me, their lenses reflecting the light from my van's headlights. It wasn't unusual for a place like this to have security cameras, but there were so many of them, and they were all focused on me in a way that felt deliberate. I brushed it off, thinking maybe I was just being paranoid, and kept walking toward the door. As I got closer to the house, I heard this strange rustling sound coming from the trees on either side of the driveway. It wasn't loud, just a faint noise like leaves or branches shifting, but there was no wind and the trees were mostly bare. I paused for a second, listening, but the sound stopped as soon as I noticed it. I looked around but didn't see anything, so I kept walking, trying to push the feeling of unease out of my mind. I reached the front door and set the package down on the porch. There was no doorbell, so I knocked a couple of times just to be polite, even though I didn't expect anyone to answer. The house was completely silent, no movement, no lights, nothing to suggest that anyone was home. I turned to leave, and that's when I heard it again, the rustling sound from the trees. This time it was louder, and it seemed to be coming from multiple directions. It sounded like something or someone was moving through the bushes just out of sight. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest, and listened carefully. The sound grew closer, and I could hear the distinct shuffle of footsteps, like someone was trying to move quietly but wasn't quite succeeding. I slowly backed away from the door and started heading back to the van, trying to stay calm. As I walked, I glanced around at the trees, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness. The security cameras were still fixed on me, tracking my every move, which only added to the unsettling feeling. I picked up my pace, trying not to look like I was freaking out, but all I wanted to do was get the hell out of there. Just as I reached the van, I heard a voice crackle through an intercom. It startled me because I hadn't noticed the intercom before, and it wasn't coming from the house. It was coming from a speaker mounted on one of the poles near the driveway. The voice was low and garbled, and I couldn't make out what it was saying at first. Then I heard it more clearly. Step back from the house. I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and took a few steps back toward the van, trying to figure out where the voice was coming from. I looked around and saw a figure moving in the bushes, just at the edge of the tree line. It was hard to make out any details in the darkness, but there was definitely someone there, crouched low, watching me. The rustling sound started up again, and I realized there were more figures moving through the trees on the other side of the driveway as well. Panic started to set in, and I quickly got back into the van, slamming the door shut behind me. I locked the doors and fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking as I tried to start the engine. When the van finally roared to life, I glanced back toward the house and saw several shadowy figures standing just beyond the tree line, partially hidden in the darkness. They weren't moving, just standing there watching me from the shadows. I didn't stick around to see what they were going to do next. I threw the van into reverse and backed down the driveway as fast as I could, my eyes darting between the rearview mirror and the dark figures by the trees. The security cameras followed me all the way down the driveway, their lenses gleaming in the darkness like cold, unblinking eyes. When I reached the gate, I was relieved to find it still open. I sped through it and didn't slow down until I was back on the main road, the lights of the van cutting through the darkness. My heart was still racing, and my mind was spinning with questions. Who were those people? What were they doing out there, lurking in the trees? And why had the security system told me to step back from the house? I didn't have any answers, and to be honest, I didn't really want to know. All I knew was that something was seriously wrong with that place. And I was lucky to have gotten out of there when I did. I drove straight back to the distribution center, turned in my paperwork, and went home without mentioning anything to my supervisor. I didn't want to sound like I was losing it, and besides, what could I even say? That there were people hiding in the trees, watching me while I delivered a package? It sounded ridiculous, even to me. I avoided taking any more routes that would bring me near that estate, and luckily I never had to go back. A few weeks later, I heard through one of my coworkers that the estate had been sold, and the new owners had done some major renovations on the place. He mentioned something about how the property had a reputation for being a little creepy, but I didn't press for details. I didn't want to know more than I already did. I don't have any explanation for what happened that night, and I've tried not to dwell on it too much. I never found out who those people were, or why they were hiding in the trees. A couple of years ago, I was working as a delivery driver. You'd think it's a pretty uneventful job, driving around, dropping off packages, and listening to music all day. For the most part, it was. Nothing much ever happened outside of the usual traffic, the occasional weird customer interaction, and the long hours on the road. I liked it well enough, but this one experience I had during a shift still creeps me out to this day. This was back in late 2019, in the middle of summer. I was living in Cleveland at the time, and my route that day was out in some of the quieter parts of the city, mostly industrial areas with warehouses and a few office buildings scattered around. It was one of those routes where I didn't have to deal with a lot of people, which I usually preferred. There were more places to pull over, less traffic, and not a lot of residential areas where you had to deal with dogs or kids running around. I'd been doing deliveries in the same area for a few months, so I knew the roads pretty well. The day started off normal enough. I left the warehouse in the early afternoon, made a few deliveries, and everything was routine. It wasn't until later in the day that things started to feel off. I was heading to one of the stops in an industrial park when I first noticed this white van trailing behind me. It wasn't right on my tail or anything, just far enough behind that I couldn't quite shake the feeling that it was following me. At first, I didn't think much of it. A lot of the roads in that area are quiet, so it wasn't unusual to have another vehicle behind you for a while. But after my next stop, when I got back onto the road, the van was still there, keeping its distance but never pulling away or passing me. I made another stop, thinking the van would keep going. But when I got back on the road, there it was again. It wasn't tailgating me or doing anything aggressive, but it was always there, hanging back just enough to not seem immediately suspicious, but still making me feel uneasy. I started to wonder if I was just being paranoid, but after the third stop where the van showed up again, I started to get that gut feeling that something wasn't right. It was an old, beat-up van, the kind you'd see parked in front of an auto repair shop or sitting outside a loading dock. There weren't any logos or markings on it, and the windows were tinted dark, so I couldn't see who was driving. I kept trying to tell myself it was just a coincidence, that maybe whoever was in the van was doing their own delivery route or something similar, but it was starting to feel deliberate. By the time I got to my fourth stop, I was really starting to get on edge. This stop was at a small warehouse in a dead part of town. Just a few empty lots and run-down buildings nearby. I pulled up, dropped off the package, and when I got back to the van, I saw the white van parked a few spots down the street, just sitting there. It hadn't been there when I arrived, and I knew it hadn't passed me on the road. Whoever was driving it had waited for me to get out of sight before pulling up behind me again. I got back into my van, and instead of continuing my route, I decided to take a detour. I figured if the van was really following me, it would stick with me even if I took a different road. So I turned down a side street, one that I knew didn't lead to any of my scheduled stops. Sure enough, the white van made the same turn a few moments later, still hanging back but definitely not losing sight of me. At that point, I knew it wasn't just a coincidence. Whoever was in that van was following me. My mind started racing, trying to figure out why. Was someone trying to rob me? Maybe they thought I was carrying cash or valuable packages. Or was it something else, something worse? I didn't know, but I wasn't about to wait around and find out. I started driving faster, trying to put some distance between me and the van. I made a few random turns, trying to shake it off my tail, but no matter where I went, the van stayed close behind. I could feel my pulse quickening, my hands gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. I was trying to stay calm, but the longer the van followed me, the harder that became. I finally decided I wasn't going to lead this person around all day. I figured the best thing I could do was head to a more populated area where there were other people around. Maybe that would be enough to make whoever was following me back off. So I pulled onto a busier road, heading toward a strip of stores and restaurants where I knew there would be more traffic. As I pulled into a parking lot outside a convenience store, I parked the van and watched in the rearview mirror as the white van pulled in a few spots down. It didn't park directly next to me, but close enough that I could still see it clearly. The engine was running, and no one got out. They just sat there waiting. I stayed in my van for a few minutes, trying to figure out what to do next. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even tell them? That a van was following me around? I didn't have a license plate number, and I hadn't actually seen the driver. I didn't know if they had done anything illegal yet, so I didn't want to overreact. Still, I didn't feel safe sitting there with that van just a few spots away. After a few more minutes of watching and waiting, I decided to leave. Maybe heading into a more crowded area hadn't worked, but I figured the next best option was to just finish up my route as quickly as possible and get back to the warehouse. I pulled out of the parking lot and got back on the road, trying to keep my cool. The van followed me again, and this time it was closer than before. It wasn't keeping as much distance as it had earlier, almost like the driver was getting impatient or bolder. I could see it in my side mirrors now, its headlights bouncing along with the bumps in the road, always staying within a few car lengths of me. I made another turn, hoping to lose it, but it followed me again. I didn't know what else to do. My mind kept racing through all the worst-case scenarios, wondering if I should stop at a police station or just drive around until the van eventually gave up. But the van didn't show any signs of giving up, and I was running out of options. At one point, I decided to take another detour down a side street that led into a small residential neighborhood. I figured maybe the narrow roads and tighter turns would make it harder for the van to keep up with me. I made a sharp left turn onto a side street and hit the gas, speeding through the quiet neighborhood as fast as I could without drawing too much attention. For a few moments, I thought I had lost the van. I didn't see it in my mirrors anymore, and I started to feel a small sense of relief. Maybe I had finally shaken it off. I made a few more turns, winding my way through the neighborhood, trying to put as much distance between myself and the van as possible. But then, as I came around a corner, I saw it again. The white van was parked at the end of the street, just sitting there like it had been waiting for me to show up. My heart sank, and I felt this cold wave of dread wash over me. This wasn't just some random person following me around. They knew exactly where I was going, and they were waiting for me. I didn't stop to think. I turned the wheel hard and sped down another side street, trying to lose the van again. I was driving faster now, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing with thoughts of what might happen if the van caught up with me. I didn't know what to do, and the fear was starting to get the better of me. I finally made the decision to head back toward the main road, figuring that if I could get onto a busier highway, I might be able to lose the van in traffic. I took a few more turns, heading toward the highway, and for a while, I didn't see the van again. I thought maybe I had finally lost it, that I could finally finish my route and get back to the warehouse in one piece. But just as I was merging onto the highway, I saw the van again, this time in the lane behind me. It was still there, still following me, and I knew I had to do something. I couldn't keep driving around like this, hoping it would go away. I needed help. I pulled out my phone and called my supervisor, telling him what was going on. He told me to come straight back to the warehouse and that they would call the police if the van followed me all the way back. I agreed and started heading back toward the warehouse, hoping that the van would lose interest or get scared off by the idea of police involvement. The drive back to the warehouse was tense. The van stayed behind me the whole way, never getting too close but never backing off either. When I finally pulled into the warehouse parking lot, I parked the van and watched as the white van slowly drove past the entrance, not stopping but still lingering just long enough to let me know they hadn't given up. I sat in the parking lot for a while, waiting to see if the van would come back, but it never did. My supervisor came out and checked on me, but by that point, the van was gone. We called the police, and they took a report. But without a license plate number or any real evidence, there wasn't much they could do. They told me to be careful and to call them if anything like that happened again. I never saw the white van again after that day, but the experience stuck with me. For weeks, I was on edge every time I got into the van for my deliveries, always checking my mirrors, always looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that van following me again. I don't know what the driver's intentions were, and maybe I'll never know. But whatever they were, I'm just glad I never had to find out. This happened a few years ago when I was working as a delivery driver for a local courier service. It wasn't the most glamorous job, but it was straightforward: pick up packages, drop them off, repeat until the end of the day. I had been doing it for a while, so I was used to the weird things that come with the job. Strange delivery instructions, odd hours, and the occasional sketchy neighborhood. But nothing prepared me for what happened one evening while delivering to an upscale apartment building in downtown Chicago. It was mid-December, a cold, dark evening with that biting wind Chicago is famous for. The holidays were right around the corner, so we were slammed with deliveries. I'd been running around the city all day, and by the time I got to this building, I was just trying to finish up my shift and head home. I wasn't in the best mood, exhausted and irritated from dealing with holiday traffic and the never-ending stream of packages. My phone dinged with another stop. An apartment building near Lincoln Park. One of those newer luxury high-rises that had gone up in recent years. The instructions were simple enough. Leave the package at the door of apartment 3C. I'd been to the building before, and it was one of those fancy places with a doorman and elevators that required a key card. The kind of place where the rent is more than most people's mortgages. I remember thinking how quiet the building seemed when I pulled up. It wasn't unusual for this time of day, though. It was around 7 p.m. And most people were either out for dinner or still at work. I parked the van, grabbed the package, and walked up to the front entrance. The doorman wasn't at his desk, which I found a little strange, but I figured he was taking a break or something. I let myself in using the call box, entered the lobby, and headed for the elevators. The place had that sterile, high-end feel to it. Polished floors, dim lighting, the faint smell of cleaning products lingering in the air. The whole building was dead silent. I got into the elevator and pressed the button for the 3rd floor. When the doors opened, I stepped out into a long, empty hallway. Everything was pristine, but there was something about the silence that made the place feel off. I shook it off as my mind playing tricks on me. It had been a long day, and I was tired. I just needed to drop off this package and get out of there. I found apartment 3C pretty easily. It was at the end of the hallway, the door standing slightly ajar. That struck me as odd. People in these kinds of places are usually pretty security conscious. I figured maybe the resident had just stepped out for a second and left the door open. So I called out a quick hello as I approached the door, just to make sure no one was going to be startled by me dropping off the package. No one responded, so I figured I'd just leave the package inside and be on my way. But as I stepped up to the doorway, I noticed something weird. There was soft music playing from inside the apartment. Classical music, like something you'd hear in an old movie or at a fancy dinner party. It wasn't loud, just faint enough to be noticeable. I knocked lightly on the door, but again, there was no answer. I nudged the door open a little more, peeking inside. The apartment was dimly lit with soft, warm lighting coming from lamps in the living room. Everything looked normal. Fancy furniture, modern decor, the kind of place you'd expect to see in a high-end building like this. But the odd thing was, there was no sign of anyone inside. I figured maybe the resident had gone out for a quick errand and left the music on. So I stepped inside and set the package down just inside the doorway. As I turned to leave, I heard a crash from somewhere deeper in the apartment. It was loud, like something heavy had fallen over. My heart jumped into my throat and I froze for a second, listening. The music was still playing, and the apartment was otherwise silent again. For a moment, I debated whether I should check it out. Maybe something had just tipped over on its own. But what if someone was in trouble? What if someone had fallen or there was a break-in? I didn't want to get involved, but at the same time, I couldn't just leave after hearing that. My mind raced with possibilities. I slowly made my way toward the sound, moving past the living room and into a hallway that led to what I assumed were the bedrooms. As I crept down the hallway, the music grew fainter, but the silence in the apartment felt heavier. There was no movement, no voices, nothing to suggest that anyone was around. I reached the end of the hallway and found myself standing outside a bedroom door. The door was closed, but the sound had definitely come from inside. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, but whatever it was, I wasn't sure I wanted to see it. After a few seconds of indecision, I took a deep breath and turned the knob. The door creaked open, and I found myself looking into a bedroom that was just as meticulously decorated as the rest of the apartment. Everything was in its place except for one thing. The mirror on the far wall had been knocked over. It was a large, full-length mirror, and it had fallen forward onto the floor, shattering into pieces. The shards were scattered across the hardwood floor, reflecting the dim light from the bedside lamp. But there was no one in the room. No sign of a struggle, no indication that anyone had been there at all. Just the broken mirror and the eerie quiet. I backed out of the room, my nerves on edge. I didn't know what to make of it. Maybe the mirror had just fallen over on its own, but it didn't seem likely. Mirrors don't just tip over like that. I was about to leave and call it in when I heard a soft click behind me. I spun around and my heart dropped. The front door, which had been ajar when I entered, was now closed. I hadn't heard anyone come in, hadn't seen anyone. But somehow, the door had shut behind me. I rushed over to it, my pulse racing, and tried the handle. It was locked. I fumbled with the lock for a moment, my hands shaking, and finally managed to get the door open. I practically bolted out of the apartment and down the hallway, my mind racing with questions. Who had shut the door? Had someone been in the apartment the whole time, watching me? I didn't wait to find out. I got into the elevator, hit the button for the lobby, and didn't look back. When I got to the lobby, the doorman was back at his desk, and I asked him if anyone had reported anything strange happening in the building. He just looked at me like I was crazy and said no. I didn't press the issue. I just wanted to get out of there. I finished my shift that night, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling from the apartment. I kept thinking about the door shutting on its own, the broken mirror, the silence that had filled the place. Something about it felt wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on what exactly had happened. I didn't tell anyone about it. Not my supervisor, not my coworkers. It just seemed too weird to bring up. A few days later, I had another delivery scheduled for the same building. When I saw the address pop up on my route, my stomach twisted in knots. I didn't want to go back, but I didn't have much of a choice. It was my job. And I couldn't exactly refuse a delivery just because I felt uneasy about it. When I got to the building, everything seemed normal. The doorman was at his desk, the lobby was quiet, and I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. But when I got into the elevator and pressed the button for the third floor, my heart started racing again. I stepped out into the hallway, and as I approached apartment 3C, I noticed that the door was closed this time. No music, no open door, just silence. I knocked, half expecting the door to creak open on its own again, but it stayed shut. I waited for a minute, but no one answered. I set the package down by the door, took a quick photo for proof of delivery, and turned to leave. As I walked away, I couldn't help but glance back over my shoulder at the door to 3C. It was still closed, and the hallway was empty, but the same uneasy feeling I'd had before was creeping back in. I didn't get any more deliveries to that apartment after that, and I was relieved. Whatever had happened in that apartment, I didn't want to be involved in it. I still think about it sometimes, though, about the mirror, the door, the strange silence that filled the place. I don't know what was going on in there, and maybe it's better that I don't. But every now and then, when I'm making a delivery late at night or walking down a quiet hallway, I remember that apartment and the way the door clicked shut behind me. It's a feeling I can't quite shake, even though nothing really happened. There was just something off about that place. Something I can't explain. I never found out who lived there. And I never asked. I didn't want to know. All I wanted was to finish my shift and forget about it. But some things stick with you no matter how much you try to push them to the back of your mind. That night in apartment 3C is one of those things. Thank you for watching. If you found these stories gripping, don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling content. For another hair-raising tale, check out our suggested video. And if you're hungry for more eerie encounters, dive into our playlist featuring similar chilling narratives.